To help us understand better how well this system works at the functions it's designed to serve, let's take the case example of Mrs. Taylor. This 52-year-old lady came into the emergency department after spending 3 days at home with fever and nausea and vomiting. She presented with trouble breathing and fever. She was evaluated, and over the next few hours, she was started on what most physicians would say is an appropriate course of therapy. She was diagnosed with pneumonia, and she was put on the right antibiotics. She was then admitted to the hospital. Early that morning, our protagonist in the story, Dr. Harris, comes on service and picks up care of Mrs. Taylor. She's examined Mrs. Taylor within a couple of hours. After a nurse reports that she has really become very, very labored in her breathing, she's perspiring heavily. After examining her, Dr. Harris puts her on an oxygen mask and then has to figure out what to do next. Once she's completed her examination, she becomes aware that this lady is really moving close into impending respiratory failure, and so she has a difficult decision to make. Should I intubate her here on the floor to help her breathe, put a tube down her throat? No, she decides, I don't have any experience with that. But what I do have is a pulmonologist waiting in the ICU who's already been involved with this lady's care and is experienced with awake intubation. So for Dr. Harris, it's an easy decision. She transfers Mrs. Taylor to the ICU in a very timely fashion. Unfortunately, when they attempt intubation in the ICU, it's complicated by the fact that Mrs. Taylor has a cardiac arrest. They succeed within 4 minutes and restore a breathing airway. But by that point, unfortunately, Mrs. Taylor has already suffered irreversible brain damage. She's no longer able, after this a very, very unfortunate event, to recognize her family members. She's going to need a lifetime of custodial care, even to help her accomplish the basic activities of daily living. So she's discharged from the hospital, and that's the end of the story. There's no review of this case within the hospital, and nobody hears from this lady or family again for 20 months, when Dr. Harris gets the call from her partner saying, "You're being sued, and that's why I'm leaving medicine." What's going on in this case? Why did it become a malpractice case? When most physicians hear about this case, they find little cause for fault with the care that Dr. Harris rendered. She was seen in a timely way, she made an appropriate diagnosis and a very appropriate decision to transfer her to ICU into the hands of a very competent pulmonologist. It seems like this was just a case of a terrible outcome that happened to a young, healthy person who unfortunately had a long life ahead of her before this event. From the family's perspective, they may see things quite differently. Knowing very little about the internal decisions that were made in the course of this patient's care, what they see now is a mother who, instead of continuing to care for minor children, is now in a long-term care facility, and who, instead of providing for her family, will now be racking up enormous expenses for this family that are unlikely to be covered by the family's other sources of insurance in full, at least without bankrupting this family in order to qualify for Medicaid. Among these are the costs of maintaining her in a long-term care facility, not to mention the cost of household production or income that she would have contributed to the family, or the lost companionship or quality of life that she and her family have experienced because of what happened here. So from the family's perspective, regardless of the quality of care, there's a profound need for income support and compensation for what has happened to them. Again, this lady was healthy 3 days prior to going into the hospital, and now she's disabled for life. The family may also be suing for other more emotional reasons. We know from research about why plaintiffs sue that anger is often a precipitating event in bringing a family to the point where they need to file a lawsuit. Atul Gawande, in his sentinel essay in the 2005 New Yorker on the malpractice mess, speaks of the malpractice system as a system for civilizing the passions, meaning it provides a conduit for the civilized expression of volatile emotions like anger. And Gawande contrasts our system to the system that was in place in China until a decade ago. China essentially offered no civil remedy at all for medical malpractice. And so what did patients' families do? They would ambush their care providers in the hallway and beat them up. So from this perspective, the malpractice system is actually a great conduit and an outlet for physicians who might otherwise suffer much worse harm. But that's not how most physicians tend to experience being sued. Going back to the family's perspective, they might have anger about this event for lots of reasons. Certainly it was an unexpected outcome. This was not a sick lady going into the hospital. She had a disease that should have been easily treatable. And what may have been in play here in part is the communication that went on between the hospital and the physician and this family. We know from lots and lots of research that the fact that a physician is a poor communicator, has a lousy bedside manner, is a strong predictor of who's going to be sued. In other research, families have also expressed things like a need to understand what happened, a need to hear somebody accept responsibility for the adverse outcome, a need to shame a provider who has been negligent, and above all, a need to know that the hospital is doing something to make them sure that this kind of thing can't happen to another family. These are all important emotional needs that families have in the aftermath of adverse events, and they are things that they reach to the tort system for, however misguidedly. They are also things that many hospitals and doctors fail to give families in the ordinary course of things after adverse events. So emotional and economic factors played into this lawsuit from the family's perspective. Now, in order to bring this claim, the family is going to have to find a plaintiff's attorney. In the U.S., you can officially bring a malpractice claim without help from an attorney, but it's a practical impossibility. Most plaintiffs' attorneys in this country operate purely on a contingency fee basis, meaning they don't get paid until you get paid, as you've seen if you've seen any commercial on TV by a plaintiff's attorney. And so the plaintiff attorney is going to look at this case and really size it up as an investor. Many physicians really castigate plaintiffs' attorneys as their opponents and enemies. But an alternative way to think about them is the major gatekeepers that keep a vast majority of malpractice potential claims from ever coming into the liability system. These guys are careful investors in cases. They're going to put their own resources into bringing a malpractice case potentially all the way through trial. That's an expensive process, and they make their decisions very carefully. When Atul Gawande interviewed Barry Lang for The New Yorker, Lang being one of the most prominent plaintiffs' attorneys in Boston, he found that Lang took the next step with potential plaintiffs who called his office only in about 1 out of every 30 calls his office received. So he's choosing carefully. And when asked how much he expected to invest in a case to bring it all the way to trial, Lang put a number in the $40,000 to $50,000 range. So plaintiffs' attorneys are going to be on the lookout for cases they can expect to recover value on. And that's going to be driven by a few things. One is the merit of the case, was there negligence? But also important is going to be the size of the expected damages, which relate to the severity of the injury and the plaintiff herself. Was she young or old? Was she a high earner or low earner? And so forth. Finally, there might be intangibles associated with the case. Who's going to make a good or bad witness on the stand that will affect which cases get brought. But a case like this is going to be very attractive to a plaintiff's attorney because here we have a young and very sympathetic woman who's been robbed of her very ability to function and very murky circumstances around the injury itself. So regardless of the fact that the negligence is not by any means clear here, this is exactly the type of case that would be attractive to a plaintiff's attorney. How about the defense attorney's perspective? The hospital would retain somebody to defend itself if Mrs. Taylor's family pursued this claim. And from their perspective, they're going to be very concerned here, again, because of the sympathetic nature of the injury and the plaintiff in this case. A jury's going to look at that and have a hard time saying no to this family in its quest to support themselves in the aftermath of this event. Now suppose there are other bad facts in the case from the hospital's perspective, relating not to Dr. Harris's care, but other aspects of the care that this lady received before Dr. Harris came on service. The handoff, for example, or the quality of the nursing monitoring in this case. In fact, that's what happened in the actual case on which this was based, and it led to the hospital's decision to settle, as it turns out, for a relatively modest amount of money. What's Dr. Harris going to think about all of this? Totally unfair. I wasn't negligent in this case. There was nothing wrong with the care that I provided, even in retrospect, much less from the perspective that I was operating in at the time I made these decisions. And it seems like I'm being punished for problems that had nothing to do with me, but had to do with other people in the hospital or our broader systems of care. This is a reasonable way to feel. But unfortunately, our malpractice system makes it very difficult for patients to recover against a hospital, generally much more easy, particularly in certain states, to recover against individual physicians. So it's not uncommon that liability tends to rest on individuals, even though there are more diffuse problems with systems of care that aren't easily attributable to the errors or negligence of any one person. Dr. Harris is also going to think about the psychological aspects of being dragged through litigation. When physicians who have gone through this experience have been interviewed about it, many describe it as the worst experience of their lives, or right up there with the death of a parent. It really is a gutting experience. It can be distracting over a period of months or even years. And so from their perspective, getting out early with a settlement may be appealing for that reason as well. Barry Lang, our plaintiff's attorney, would tell them, look guys, this is just part of the cost of doing business as a doctor. Bad things happen, and that's why you have insurance. Don't take it personally. But that's a piece of advice that physicians find very difficult to follow. Finally, how's a jury going to view this case? Because everybody else's behavior in settlement is going to be driven by what they think a jury would do. Well, a lot of it is going to depend, again, on the jury's ability to identify with the plaintiff. And again, the concern would be this is a very sympathetic lady. They're going to be thinking about the needs this family has and who's going to provide for these needs. In this country, unlike other countries in Europe and around the world, we don't have a strong, comprehensive social insurance scheme that provides for families in extremis like this. We have a patchwork of minimal Social Security disability and other forms of disability insurance that will offer some support, but we as a society don't do a great job of taking care of people like this. The tort system is the way that we provide for families like this to get fuller compensation, and the jury's going to understand that. But there's one common misconception that people have about juries, and that is that they're so sympathetic that it's always to the plaintiff's advantage to try a case. Not true. In a study that colleagues and I did here at the Harvard School of Public Health, plaintiffs actually lost 4 out of 5 malpractice trials. When you win in a jury trial, you win big. The average payment that you take out of a jury trial is over twice the average payment that you might take in a settlement. But 80% chance as a plaintiff you're going to lose these trials, and that's why most litigation settles before it ever reaches trial. So to sum up, Mrs. Taylor's case is one of those cases doctors hate to think about. What seems like an unavoidable bad outcome or just bad luck gets hanged on the shoulders of an individual physician who doesn't seem to have done anything wrong. This seems totally unjust, but it's understandable both why they decided to settle this case and why it was brought in the first place. This is a family that has serious needs, and this is the system we've handed them for dealing with those needs. So overall, this case seems like a really unfortunate example of a malpractice case. How common are cases like this? In general, does our system do a better job of resolving malpractice disputes? We'll take a look at that next.